Morning begins the way it always does, quietly, almost invisibly. Long before most people wake up, the world is already in motion. Far out at sea, beyond coastlines and skylines, ships move along invisible paths drawn across the surface of the ocean. They do not rush. They do not stop. They follow schedules measured in weeks, not minutes, carrying cargo that rarely belongs to a single place. Oil, gas, raw materials, everything that keeps modern life moving passes through these routes without announcement. In one particular stretch of water, this movement is especially constant. It is narrow compared to the vastness around it, almost insignificant on a map, yet it carries a rhythm that never truly pauses. Tankers glide through in long, steady lines, their hulls heavy with crude oil drawn from deep beneath desert landscapes. Each one is a floating reservoir, containing enough energy to power cities, industries, entire regions. They move carefully, guided through shipping lanes that are only a few kilometers wide, separated to prevent collision, watched by satellites, monitored by governments, insured by companies that calculate risk down to the smallest fraction. To anyone standing on the shore, there is nothing dramatic about it. No noise reaches land. No urgency is visible. Just distant silhouettes, moving slowly across the horizon. It feels stable, predictable, permanent. But stability, in systems like this, is not something you see. It is something you assume. At any given moment, dozens of these tankers are passing through this narrow corridor. More are waiting just outside, queued like aircraft circling an unseen runway. Behind them are ports loading continuously, pumps transferring millions of barrels each day from land to sea. Ahead of them are destinations scattered across the globe, refineries preparing to receive what has already been sold, already expected, already built into the functioning of economies that depend on it without ever seeing it. Nothing about this feels fragile, and then without warning the movement slows, not dramatically at first. A delay here, a hesitation there, one ship reduces speed, another changes course slightly. Communication channels begin to fill with messages that are not yet urgent, but no longer routine. Something has changed, though no one can quite define it in that moment. Within minutes, the pattern begins to break. Ships that were meant to enter the narrow passage stop just short of it, holding position in open water. Others already inside reduce speed further, as if waiting for instructions that have not yet arrived. Navigation systems continue to function. The sea remains calm. There is no visible obstruction, no storm, no accident blocking the way. And yet, movement begins to fade. From above, the effect is subtle but unmistakable. A system that has never paused begins to hesitate, like a heartbeat skipping a rhythm it has followed for decades. No announcement is made, no single event marks the moment, but the flow has been interrupted. Hours pass and the silence deepens. Shipping companies begin to reroute vessels that have not yet reached the area, sending them into holding patterns far from the strait. Insurance firms issue quiet warnings, not yet public, but enough to trigger internal protocols. Risk models begin to shift, numbers recalculating faster than decisions can be made. The tankers already inside the corridor remain where they are, suspended between departure and arrival, waiting for clarity that does not come. Somewhere else, far from the water, screens begin to flicker with changes that feel small at first. Numbers adjust. Prices move slightly. Analysts notice, then hesitate, unsure whether what they are seeing is temporary or something larger. It does not take long. Within the first hour, oil markets react. Not violently, not yet, but enough to signal that something is wrong. Prices begin to climb, not because of confirmed information, but because of uncertainty. And uncertainty in systems built on precision spreads faster than any physical disruption ever could. By the second hour, the movement is no longer subtle. Energy traders, watching live data streams, begin to respond. Orders are placed, contracts shift. Speculation fills the gaps left by missing information. The price of oil rises again, this time more sharply, as if the system itself is beginning to understand what it cannot yet see. Still, there is no clear explanation. The ships remain. The sea remains. But the flow does not resume. Elsewhere, far removed from the strait itself, the first indirect effects begin to appear. Airlines, operating on tight fuel margins, start adjusting calculations. Logistics companies quietly review contingency plans. Refineries, expecting shipments that are now uncertain, begin to prepare for delays they cannot yet confirm. No one panics, not yet. But something has shifted beneath the surface. Something that connects all of these systems in ways that are rarely noticed until they begin to fail. By the third hour, the absence becomes visible. Satellite tracking systems, which monitor global shipping in real time, show a pattern that has never appeared before. The narrow corridor that once carried a constant stream of movement now shows clusters of stationary vessels grouped just outside its boundaries, waiting. Waiting for what? No one can say with certainty. News begins to circulate, fragmented and incomplete. Reports mention tensions, incidents, precautionary measures, words that suggest importance without revealing detail. Governments issue statements that acknowledge concern but avoid clarity. The language is careful, controlled, designed to prevent escalation while offering no reassurance. On trading floors, the reaction becomes sharper. Oil prices spike again, not gradually now, but in sudden jumps, each one larger than the last. The numbers no longer reflect supply and demand alone. They reflect fear, expectation, the realization that something critical may be unfolding in a place most people have never thought about. And still, the ships do not move. By the time the fourth hour passes, the system begins to feel it in places far removed from the origin of the disruption. Currency markets react. Energy-dependent industries begin to adjust forecasts. Governments contact one another behind closed doors, seeking information that remains incomplete. There is no explosion, no visible crisis, just the absence of movement where movement has always existed. And that absence is enough, because what has stopped is not just a group of ships, it is a flow that the world depends on without ever seeing it directly. As the hours continue, the realization spreads quietly, almost reluctantly, not as a single moment of understanding, but as a gradual alignment of facts that no longer fit together the way they did before. The tankers are still there, the waterway is still open, nothing appears physically blocked, and yet nothing moves. The system has not collapsed in the way people expect systems to collapse. There is no dramatic failure, no visible break. Instead, it has paused, as if something invisible has interrupted the logic that keeps it running. And in that pause, something else becomes clear. The world is not reacting to what has happened. It is reacting to what might happen next. Because in a system built on constant movement, even a moment of stillness carries consequences that extend far beyond the place where it began. And as that stillness continues, stretching from minutes into hours, the question begins to form, not loudly, but persistently, in the background of every decision, every calculation, every rising number on every screen. Not what has stopped, but what exactly this narrow stretch of water has been holding together all along. And what happens if it doesn't start moving again? What makes that stillness so unsettling is not just that something has stopped, but that most people would struggle to point to exactly where it has stopped. The interruption doesn't happen in a place that lives in everyday awareness. It doesn't sit next to major cities or pass through landscapes people recognize instantly. It exists in a part of the world that, for many, remains abstract, something glimpsed only briefly on a map, if at all, and then forgotten just as quickly. And yet, everything that just paused traces back to a narrow stretch of water between land masses that feel distant, politically complex, and easy to overlook unless something goes wrong. If you were to look at a globe and run your finger along the Middle East, past the vast deserts of the Arabian Peninsula and the mountainous edge of Iran, you would eventually find a thin opening where the Persian Gulf meets the open ocean. It does not look remarkable. It does not dominate the map. It is simply a narrow gap, bordered on one side by Iran and on the other by Oman and the United Arab Emirates, connecting a region rich in energy resources to the rest of the world. This is the Strait of Hormuz, though most people encounter the name only in passing, often without context, often without realizing how central it is to the structure of modern life. The geography itself is deceptively simple. At its narrowest point, the strait is only about 30 to 33 kilometers wide, a distance that, on land, could be crossed in less than an hour by car. Within that width, however, the space available for shipping is even smaller. The waterway is divided into two narrow lanes, each only a few kilometers wide, one for inbound traffic and one for outbound, separated by a buffer zone to reduce the risk of collision. These lanes are not suggestions, they are necessities. The volume of traffic passing through is so high, and the ships themselves so large that there is little room for deviation. A fully loaded oil tanker can stretch hundreds of meters in length, moving slowly due to its weight, requiring careful navigation to avoid disaster. When multiple vessels pass through this constrained corridor at the same time, the margin for error becomes almost non-existent. And yet, this narrow passage carries a flow that is difficult to fully grasp without stepping back and considering its scale. Every day, somewhere between 17 and 20 million barrels of oil move through this strait. That is not a number most people can visualize easily, so it helps to translate it into something more tangible. Imagine hundreds of massive tankers, each filled to capacity, passing through continuously, day after day, without pause. Each of those shipments is already accounted for before it leaves port. It has a destination, a buyer, a role to play in systems that depend on its arrival. The oil does not simply exist as a commodity. It is embedded in contracts, in expectations, in the functioning of entire economies that rely on its steady movement. What makes this even more striking is that the strait is not just a pathway for oil from a single country. It is the primary export route for multiple nations in the Gulf region, including Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, and the United Arab Emirates, along with significant volumes of liquefied natural gas, particularly from Qatar. Together, these flows represent a substantial portion of the world's energy supply. Not a small share, not a regional detail, but a global artery that feeds into industries, transportation systems, and infrastructure across continents. And yet, despite this immense importance, the Strait of Hormuz rarely occupies space in everyday thinking. It does not feature prominently in conversations about daily life. It is not something people wake up considering when they turn on their cars, board flights, or purchase goods that have travelled thousands of kilometres to reach them. Its operation is so consistent, so uninterrupted, that it fades into the background, becoming part of the assumed stability of the world. This is the paradox of critical systems. The more reliable they are, the less visible they become. Over time, their presence is replaced by expectation. People do not think about the flow of oil any more than they think about the flow of electricity through wires hidden in walls. It is simply there until it isn't. The strait itself does not announce its significance. There are no dramatic visual cues to suggest that this narrow corridor holds such weight. The surrounding landscape is harsh, defined by arid coastlines, rocky terrain, and waters that appear calm under most conditions. From a distance, it could be mistaken for any number of similar passages around the world. There's nothing about its appearance that communicates its role as one of the most important choke points on the planet. The term choke point itself is revealing. It implies vulnerability, a place where flow can be constrained, where a system that otherwise operates freely is forced through a narrow space. In global trade, choke points are both necessary and risky. They allow for efficiency, concentrating movement into defined routes, but they also create points of potential disruption, where the entire system can be affected by events localized in a very small area. The Strait of Hormuz is the most critical of these choke points when it comes to energy. There are others, such as the Suez Canal or the Panama Canal, but they serve different functions and can to some extent be bypassed or supplemented. Hormuz is different. The geography of the region, combined with the distribution of oil reserves and infrastructure, means that there are very few viable alternatives for moving such large volumes of energy out of the Gulf. Pipelines exist, but their capacity is limited compared to the scale of what passes through the strait. Shipping remains the primary method, and the strait remains the narrow gate through which that shipping must pass. This creates a situation where something small in terms of physical space holds an outsized influence over something vast in terms of global impact. It is the kind of imbalance that is easy to ignore until it becomes impossible to ignore. When everything is functioning, the imbalance feels like efficiency. When something goes wrong, it reveals itself as fragility. The stillness from before begins to make more sense in this context, not because the geography has changed, but because the perception of it has. What was once invisible becomes sharply defined. What was once background becomes foreground. The narrowness of the passage is no longer an abstract detail. It becomes the central fact around which everything else begins to reorganize. Ships waiting outside the strait are not just delayed vessels. They are indicators of a system that has encountered resistance at one of its most critical points. Markets reacting are not just responding to news. They are recalibrating based on the understanding that a significant portion of global supply is now uncertain. And the absence of movement, which at first seemed like a minor anomaly, begins to take on a different meaning entirely. It is no longer just a pause. It is a signal that something fundamental, something most people rarely think about, has been exposed. What begins to emerge from that realization is not just the importance of a place, but the scale of what moves through it every single day, quietly, without interruption, as if it were as natural as tides or wind. The numbers themselves are often mentioned in passing, repeated in reports and analyses, but rarely allowed to fully settle in the imagination. Around 1/5 of the world's oil supply passes through this narrow stretch of water. Not a fraction that can be easily replaced, not a surplus that can be redirected without consequence, but a core portion of the energy that powers modern civilization. It is difficult to grasp what that actually means in practical terms, because oil is rarely experienced in its raw form. People do not see barrels of crude arriving at their homes or workplaces. They see the results of it, transformed, distributed, embedded in systems so familiar that they feel detached from their source. To understand the weight of that 20%, it helps to slow the flow down, to translate it into something that feels less abstract. Imagine, for a moment, the fuel inside a single car. A full tank allows movement, independence, the ability to travel without thinking about the origin of that energy. Now multiply that by millions of vehicles across cities, countries, continents. Then extend it further to include aircraft crossing oceans, cargo ships transporting goods, trucks delivering food, machinery operating in factories, generators providing electricity in regions where grids are unstable. All of that movement, all of that activity, depends in some way on oil, either directly or through layers of infrastructure that trace back to it. And every day, a significant portion of that energy begins its journey by passing through the same narrow corridor that has now fallen silent. The scale becomes even more striking when considered over time. 17 to 20 million barrels per day is not just a statistic. It is a continuous flow, hour after hour, minute after minute, with no natural pause. Each barrel represents stored energy, compressed over millions of years beneath the Earth's surface, extracted, transported, and finally released to power something in the present. When multiplied by millions, it becomes a river of energy, invisible yet essential, moving through a bottleneck that has no equal in its significance. And oil is only part of the story. Alongside it travels liquefied natural gas, particularly from Qatar, one of the world's largest exporters. Unlike oil, which can be stored relatively easily, natural gas in its liquefied form requires careful handling, specialized infrastructure, and constant movement to meet demand. Countries that rely on these shipments often do not have large reserves. They depend on regular deliveries to maintain power generation, heating, and industrial processes. When those deliveries are disrupted, the effects are not delayed for long. They begin to surface quickly, often in ways that are less visible at first but no less critical. The connection between these energy flows and everyday life is not always obvious, because it is mediated through systems designed to make it seamless. Fuel arrives at stations without explanation. Electricity flows through grids without visible origin. Goods appear in stores, their supply chains hidden behind layers of logistics that operate continuously in the background. This seamlessness creates a sense of independence, as if each part of the system exists on its own, disconnected from distant sources. But that sense is an illusion, one that depends entirely on the uninterrupted movement of resources across vast distances. Oil, in particular, occupies a unique position within this system because of how deeply it is embedded in multiple layers of modern life. It is not just a fuel, it is a raw material. It is refined into gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, and heating oil, but also into plastics, synthetic fibers, chemicals, and countless other products that form the physical basis of everyday objects. The packaging that protects food, the materials used in construction, the components inside electronic devices all trace back in some way to petroleum. Even agriculture, which might seem distant from energy markets, is closely tied to oil and gas. Fertilizers are produced using natural gas. Machinery runs on diesel. Transportation networks distribute crops across regions and continents. When the flow of energy is disrupted, the effects ripple outward, touching systems that at first appear unrelated. This is why the stillness in that narrow strait does not remain confined to shipping lanes. it begins to propagate through networks that depend on the assumption of constant supply. A delay in oil shipments affects refineries, which in turn affects fuel availability, which then influences transportation costs. Those costs feed into the price of goods, altering supply chains that stretch across multiple countries. The connection is not always immediate, but it is inevitable. Each layer of the system is linked to the one before it, forming a chain that extends from extraction to consumption. When one link is strained, the tension spreads. What makes this particularly significant is the way modern economies are structured around efficiency. Over time, systems have been optimized to reduce waste, minimize storage, and maintain steady flows rather than large reserves. This approach works well under stable conditions because it reduces costs and increases responsiveness. But it also means that there is less buffer when something goes wrong. Supplies are expected to arrive when needed, not to sit idle in storage. When that expectation is disrupted, even briefly, the effects can cascade more quickly than many anticipate. The Strait of Hormuz sits at a point where these flows converge, making it not just a passage, but a central artery in a much larger system. Like any artery, its importance is not always felt until something interrupts it. As long as the flow continues, it remains invisible, part of the background processes that sustain everything else. But when the flow stops, even temporarily, the absence becomes immediately apparent, not because people suddenly learn about the strait, but because the systems they rely on begin to behave differently. Prices shift, availability changes, uncertainty grows, and that uncertainty spreads, moving through markets, industries, and governments, each reacting to the same underlying disruption from different angles. The idea that such a small geographic feature can have such a large impact challenges intuitive understanding. It suggests that scale in global systems is not determined solely by physical size, but by position within a network. The Strait of Hormuz is small in absolute terms, but its position at the intersection of major energy flows gives it a significance that far exceeds its dimensions. It is a point where multiple dependencies overlap, creating a concentration of importance that is difficult to replicate elsewhere. As the stillness continues, this concentration becomes more visible. The numbers that once seemed abstract begin to translate into real-world implications. The movement of ships is no longer just a logistical detail, it becomes a measure of stability. The absence of movement becomes a signal of disruption, one that carries meaning far beyond the immediate location. And as that signal spreads, it reveals something fundamental about the way the modern world is structured. That beneath the complexity, beneath the layers of technology and infrastructure, there are still narrow points where everything converges, where the flow of essential resources depends on conditions that can change, sometimes quickly, sometimes without warning. What becomes increasingly unsettling as that realization settles in is the quiet assumption that there must be alternatives, that systems this important would never be allowed to depend so heavily on a single narrow passage without some form of redundancy built in. It feels logical, almost comforting to imagine that somewhere beyond the horizon there are backup routes, parallel systems waiting to absorb the pressure if something goes wrong. And to a certain extent, those alternatives do exist. Pipelines stretch across deserts, connecting oil fields to ports that lie outside the reach of the strait. Tankers can, in theory, be redirected to longer routes that circle entire regions. Governments maintain strategic reserves, vast underground storage sites designed for moments of disruption. On paper, It appears as though the system has prepared for this possibility, but as each of these alternatives is examined more closely, the sense of security they offer begins to thin, revealing limits that are not immediately obvious at first glance. The pipelines, for example, represent one of the most frequently cited solutions. Saudi Arabia operates a major east-west pipeline that carries oil from fields in the eastern part of the country to ports on the Red Sea, effectively bypassing the Strait of Hormuz. The United Arab Emirates has a similar system, allowing some of its oil to reach the Gulf of Oman without passing through the narrow corridor. These infrastructures are often presented as evidence that the region is not entirely dependent on the strait, that there are built-in mechanisms to maintain flow even under strained conditions. But the key detail lies in capacity. These pipelines were not designed to replace the full volume that normally moves through the strait. They were designed to supplement it, to provide flexibility, not substitution. When the numbers are placed side by side, the gap becomes clear. The total capacity of these bypass routes falls significantly short of the daily volume that typically passes through the strait. Even if every available pipeline were operating at maximum output, even if maintenance schedules were pushed aside and systems were pushed to their limits, they could only carry a fraction of what is needed to maintain normal global supply. The rest would have nowhere to go. Oil would remain stranded at its source, unable to reach the markets that depend on it. And pipelines themselves are not immune to disruption. They require maintenance, they are vulnerable to damage, and they operate within political and geographical constraints that limit how quickly they can be expanded or adapted. They are not flexible in the way shipping routes can be, and their capacity cannot be increased overnight. Building new pipelines is a process that takes years, often decades, involving complex negotiations, environmental considerations, and massive financial investments. They are solutions for long-term planning, not immediate crises. Shipping, on the other hand, offers a different kind of flexibility, but it comes with its own set of limitations. In theory, tankers could be rerouted around alternative paths, avoiding the strait entirely, but geography imposes its own constraints. The Persian Gulf is not easily bypassed. To avoid the Strait of Hormuz, oil would first need to leave the Gulf through routes that simply do not exist in sufficient capacity. Once outside, alternative maritime paths often involve significantly longer distances. Ships that would normally pass through the strait in a matter of hours would instead be forced to travel around entire regions, adding days or even weeks to their journeys. This is not just a matter of time, but of cost and availability. Tankers are part of a global fleet with limited numbers. Extending each journey reduces the total number of trips that fleet can make over a given period. It effectively reduces global shipping capacity at the exact moment when demand for transportation is increasing, freight rates rise, competition for available vessels intensifies, and delays begin to compound. What was once a continuous flow becomes a series of bottlenecks, each one adding pressure to the system. And then there is the issue of demand itself, which does not pause simply because supply routes are disrupted. The world consumes energy at a constant pace, driven by the needs of billions of people and the systems that support them. Power plants require fuel to generate electricity. Transportation networks depend on a steady supply of gasoline and diesel. Industries rely on consistent inputs to maintain production. These demands do not diminish quickly. They persist, creating a situation where any reduction in supply is felt almost immediately. Strategic reserves are often mentioned as a buffer against such disruptions, and they do play an important role. Countries like the United States, members of the International Energy Agency, and others maintain large stockpiles of oil specifically for emergencies. These reserves can be released to stabilize markets, to provide temporary relief when supply is interrupted. But they are, by definition, temporary. They are designed to buy time, not to replace long-term supply. Releasing oil from reserves does not solve the underlying problem of disrupted flow. It simply delays the consequences, spreading them out over a longer period. And even these reserves are not infinite. Their use must be carefully managed, balancing immediate needs against the possibility of prolonged disruption. The deeper issue, however, lies in the structure of the modern global economy, which has been shaped by decades of optimization toward efficiency. Supply chains have been refined to minimize storage, reduce costs, and ensure that goods and resources arrive exactly when needed. This just-in-time model has transformed industries, allowing them to operate with remarkable precision and minimal waste. But it also means that there is very little slack in the system. Inventories are kept low, buffers are minimized, and reliance on continuous flow becomes absolute. When that flow is interrupted, even briefly, the effects can propagate quickly. There is no large zappes of unused capacity waiting to be activated. There are no vast reserves of idle resources ready to fill the gap. Instead, there is a tightly interconnected network where each part depends on the timely function of the others. This interconnectedness amplifies the impact of disruption. A delay in one area leads to adjustments in another, which then affect a third, creating a chain reaction that can spread across regions and industries. What initially appears as a localized problem becomes a global issue, not because of its scale at the source, but because of the way systems are linked together. The absence of a true backup plan is not the result of oversight or negligence. It is a consequence of the way the system has evolved, prioritizing efficiency and cost-effectiveness over redundancy. Redundancy, while valuable in times of crisis, is expensive to maintain during periods of stability. It requires additional infrastructure, unused capacity, and resources that may sit idle for long stretches of time. In a competitive global market, such inefficiencies are often reduced or eliminated, leaving systems lean but vulnerable. As the stillness in the strait continues, this vulnerability becomes more apparent. The alternatives that once seemed reassuring reveal their limitations, not because they fail entirely, but because they were never designed to carry the full weight of the system on their own. They are partial solutions, fragments of a larger network that depends on the continuous movement through a single, narrow passage. And without that passage functioning as expected, the illusion of a seamless, resilient system begins to fade, replaced by a more complex and less comfortable reality. What begins to emerge from that realization is that the Strait of Hormuz is not just a piece of geography or a logistical bottleneck. It is a place where power concentrates, where influence is measured not only in territory, but in the ability to control movement itself, and along its northern edge sits Iran, a country whose coastline curves along the strait like a hand resting over a valve, close enough to touch, close enough to influence, and for decades that proximity has shaped how the world thinks about this narrow passage. Because control here does not require ownership of the entire waterway. It requires presence, awareness, and the ability to act quickly in a confined space where ships have limited room to maneuver, and Iran has built its strategy around exactly that understanding, investing not in overwhelming naval dominance but in asymmetric capabilities, small fast attack boats, coastal missile systems, naval mines, tools designed not to control the sea in the traditional sense but to disrupt it, to create uncertainty, to raise the cost of passage high enough that even the possibility of conflict becomes a deterrent. And this approach, transforms the strait into something more than a shipping route. It becomes a pressure point, a place where tension can be applied without necessarily triggering full-scale war, where signals can be sent through actions that fall just below the threshold of open conflict, and across the water, on the southern side, lie the Gulf states, countries whose economies are deeply tied to the very flow that passes through this corridor: Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Qatar, nations that rely on the export of oil and gas not just as a source of revenue but as the foundation of their modern development, their cities, their infrastructure, their global influence, all of it connected to the steady movement of tankers leaving the Gulf. And for them, the strait is not just a strategic location, it is a lifeline, one that cannot easily be replaced or rerouted. And this creates a dynamic where the same stretch of water represents both leverage and vulnerability, depending on which side you stand. And layered over this regional tension is the presence of global powers, most notably the United States, whose navy has maintained a continuous presence in the region for decades, patrolling the waters, escorting vessels during periods of heightened risk, conducting exercises that signal both readiness and intent. And this presence is not just about protecting shipping lanes, it is about maintaining a broader balance of power, ensuring that no single actor can unilaterally control a passage that affects the entire global economy and the ships themselves. Massive carriers, destroyers, support vessels move through these waters with a kind of deliberate visibility, a reminder that the strait is not just a regional concern but a global one, that what happens here is watched closely by capitals far beyond the Middle East. And yet this concentration of military and economic interest does not simplify the situation, it complicates it, because every action is interpreted, every movement carries meaning, and the margin for miscalculation becomes thinner in a space where so many interests overlap, and history offers glimpses of how quickly this tension can surface. Moments when tankers were targeted, when mines were discovered in shipping lanes, when naval confrontations came close to escalation, each incident reinforcing the idea that the stability of the strait is not guaranteed. It is maintained, actively, continuously, through a balance that must be constantly managed. And what makes this balance particularly fragile is that it operates in a grey area, not quite peace, not quite conflict, a state where deterrence and signalling play as much of a role as actual force. And this is where the concept of a pressure point becomes most tangible, because pressure does not always result in immediate rupture. Sometimes it builds slowly, imperceptibly, creating conditions where a small trigger can have outsized consequences, and in the context of the Strait of Hormuz, that trigger could be anything from a political decision to a misinterpreted maneuver at sea, a moment where intention and perception diverge just enough to set events in motion. And the global nature of the strait means that such a moment would not remain contained within the region. It would ripple outward, affecting markets, supply chains, and the daily lives of people who may never have heard of the place until that point. And this is what gives the strait its unique weight in global affairs. It is not just the volume of oil that passes through it. Though that is significant, it is the concentration of interests, the alignment of geography, economics, and politics in a way that amplifies the impact of any disruption. And as the earlier realization about the lack of a true backup plan settles in, this layer of geopolitical tension adds another dimension, because it suggests that the risk is not purely theoretical. It is embedded in the structure of the region itself, in the relationships between the countries that border the strait and the powers that operate within it. And that structure does not remain static. It evolves, influenced by shifting alliances, changing policies, and the broader currents of international relations, which means that the stability of the strait is not something that can be taken for granted. It is something that must be continuously negotiated, implicitly and explicitly, by the actors involved. And in that sense, the stillness imagined earlier, the sudden halt of movement, is not just a logistical scenario. It is the visible outcome of underlying tensions that have been present all along. Tensions that turn a narrow stretch of water into one of the most consequential places on the planet, not because of its size, but because of what it represents and what it connects, and how easily that connection can become a point of friction when the balance that holds it together begins to shift. And what makes that balance feel even more fragile is the fact that it has already been tested, not once, but many times, in ways that never fully tipped into catastrophe, yet came close enough to reveal how quickly the situation can shift from controlled tension to something far more unpredictable. And if you trace the history of the Strait through the past decades, it begins to feel less like a stable shipping lane and more like a sequence of warnings that were narrowly avoided. Moments where the system bent under pressure but never quite broke. And each of those moments leaves behind a quiet realization that the line between normal operation and global disruption is far thinner than it appears, because this is not a place where risk suddenly arrives out of nowhere. It is a place where risk is always present, sometimes visible, sometimes hidden just beneath the surface, and occasionally it rises high enough for the world to notice, like during the tanker war of the 1980s, when the conflict between Iran and Iraq extended into the waters of the Gulf, and commercial shipping became a direct target, turning oil tankers into moving vulnerabilities, slow, massive vessels carrying millions of barrels of oil through narrow waters where there was no real room to escape if something went wrong. And it did go wrong repeatedly, with ships struck by missiles, damaged by mines, or forced to reroute under constant threat. And for the crews on board, this was not an abstract geopolitical situation. It was a daily reality where every journey carried the possibility of not making it through, where the horizon could shift in an instant from calm to chaos. And what made it even more unsettling was that many of the threats were invisible. Naval mines drifting silently beneath the surface, undetectable until the moment of impact, turning the act of simply passing through the strait into something that required both precision and luck. And the response from global powers revealed just how critical this corridor had already become, because the United States stepped in with Operation Earnest Will, escorting tankers through the strait, not to expand territory or assert dominance in the traditional sense, but to keep the flow of oil moving, to protect a system that had already become essential to the global economy. And even with that level of military presence, the risks did not disappear. They adapted. And one of the clearest reminders of that came in 1988, when the USS Samuel B. Roberts struck a mine and was nearly lost, a modern warship brought to the brink by a relatively simple weapon. And that moment revealed something important about this environment, that power alone does not eliminate vulnerability. It only reshapes how that vulnerability is managed. And as time moved forward, the methods evolved, but the pattern remained. Incidents that stopped just short of full escalation, events that caused damage, disruption, and fear, but never quite crossed the threshold into open conflict. And in more recent years, this pattern has taken on new forms, quieter in some ways, but no less significant. Tankers being boarded or seized under disputed circumstances, ships damaged by limpet mines attached carefully below the waterline, explosions that were precise enough to send a message without triggering immediate large-scale retaliation. And what makes these incidents so effective is not just the physical damage they cause, but the uncertainty they create, because in many cases responsibility is denied or contested, leaving space for interpretation. And in that uncertainty, the perception of risk grows, and perception in a system like this can be just as powerful as reality, because shipping companies, insurers and governments all make decisions based on what they believe might happen next, not just what has already happened, and that is where the impact begins to spread beyond the immediate incident. Insurance premiums rise, routes are reconsidered, schedules are adjusted, and suddenly the flow of goods begins to slow, not because the strait is physically blocked, but because the conditions around it have become too uncertain to ignore. And then there are the moments when the threat extends beyond the ships themselves, reaching into the infrastructure that supports the entire system, like the attacks on Saudi oil facilities in 2019, which temporarily removed a significant portion of global oil production from the market. And even though those facilities were not located within the strait, they were part of the same network, the same chain that connects production to transportation to consumption. And what that incident demonstrated was that the vulnerability of the system is not limited to a single location. It is spread across multiple points, each one capable of producing effects that ripple outward, and this adds another layer of complexity, because it means that maintaining stability is not just about securing the waterway itself, but about protecting an entire network of interconnected assets. And what becomes clear when you look at all of these events together is that they share a common characteristic. They all came close to something larger. They all approached a boundary that, if crossed, could have triggered a much wider crisis. And yet each time, for different reasons, that boundary held, whether due to restraint, calculation, or simple chance. And this idea of almost becomes central to understanding the strait, because it suggests that the current stability is not the result of an absence of threats, but the result of those threats being managed, contained, or limited just enough to prevent escalation. And that is a very different kind of stability, one that depends on continuous balance rather than fixed security, and that balance can be influenced by many factors: political decisions, changes in leadership, shifts in regional dynamics, or even miscommunication in moments where clarity is most needed, because in such a crowded and strategically sensitive environment, small misunderstandings can carry significant consequences. Naval vessels operating in close proximity, monitoring each other's movements, interpreting signals, responding to perceived intent. And in those situations, the difference between routine interaction and serious incident can be measured in seconds, in how a maneuver is interpreted, in whether a warning is understood as a precaution or a threat. And this is what makes the strait such a unique and precarious place. It is not just a physical choke point, it is a place where multiple layers of tension converge: economic, political, and military, all operating at the same time, all influencing how events unfold. And when those layers align in a certain way, the potential for disruption increases, not necessarily through a single dramatic action, but through a chain of smaller events that build on each other, each one adding pressure, each one narrowing the margin for error, until the system is operating much closer to its limits than it appears from the outside. And this is why these incidents matter, not just as isolated stories, but as indicators of how the system behaves under stress, how it responds, how it adapts, and how close it comes to breaking. Because every near miss reveals something about where those limits are, and how easily they could be exceeded. And when you place that understanding alongside everything that has already been established, The lack of true alternatives, the dependence of global systems on this narrow passage, the speed at which disruptions can spread, the picture becomes clearer and more unsettling because it shows that the question is not whether the strait can be disrupted, that has already been demonstrated in smaller ways, but how far that disruption could go if the conditions were just slightly different, if one incident did not stop where the others did. And in that sense, the history of these events is not just a record of what has happened, it is a preview of what could happen, a series of glimpses into a scenario that the world has come close to experiencing but has not yet fully faced, and that makes every new incident feel less like an isolated event and more like part of an ongoing story, one that is still unfolding, one that continues to test the boundaries of a system that the world depends on far more than most people realize. And what makes that balance feel even more fragile is the fact that it has already been tested, not once, but many times, in ways that never fully tipped into catastrophe, yet came close enough to reveal how quickly the situation can shift from controlled tension to something far more unpredictable. And if you trace the history of the Strait through the past decades, it begins to feel less like a stable shipping lane, and more like a sequence of warnings that were narrowly avoided. Moments where the system bent under pressure but never quite broke. And each of those moments leaves behind a quiet realization that the line between normal operation and global disruption is far thinner than it appears. Because this is not a place where risk suddenly arrives out of nowhere. It is a place where risk is always present, sometimes visible, sometimes hidden just beneath the surface, and occasionally it rises high enough for the world to notice, like during the tanker war of the 1980s when the conflict between Iran and Iraq extended into the waters of the Gulf, and commercial shipping became a direct target, turning oil tankers into moving vulnerabilities, slow, massive vessels carrying millions of barrels of oil through narrow waters where there was no real room to escape if something went wrong, and it did go wrong, repeatedly, with ships struck by missiles, damaged by mines, or forced to reroute under constant threat. And for the crews on board, this was not an abstract geopolitical situation. It was a daily reality where every journey carried the possibility of not making it through, where the horizon could shift in an instant from calm to chaos. And what made it even more unsettling was that many of the threats were invisible. Naval mines drifting silently beneath the surface, undetectable until the moment of impact, turning the act of simply passing through the strait into something that required both precision and luck. And the response from global powers revealed just how critical this corridor had already become, because the United States stepped in with Operation Earnest Will, escorting tankers through the strait, not to expand territory or assert dominance in the traditional sense, but to keep the flow of oil moving, to protect a system that had already become essential to the global economy. And even with that level of military presence, the risks did not disappear, they adapted. And one of the clearest reminders of that came in 1988, when the USS Samuel B. Roberts struck a mine and was nearly lost, a modern warship brought to the brink by a relatively simple weapon. And that moment revealed something important about this environment, that power alone does not eliminate vulnerability. It only reshapes how that vulnerability is managed. And as time moved forward, the methods evolved, but the pattern remained. Incidents that stopped just short of full escalation, events that caused damage, disruption and fear, but never quite crossed the threshold into open conflict. And in more recent years, this pattern has taken on new forms, quieter in some ways, but no less significant. Tankers being boarded or seized under disputed circumstances, ships damaged by limpet mines attached carefully below the waterline. explosions that were precise enough to send a message without triggering immediate large-scale retaliation. And what makes these incidents so effective is not just the physical damage they cause, but the uncertainty they create, because in many cases responsibility is denied or contested, leaving space for interpretation. And in that uncertainty, the perception of risk grows, and perception in a system like this can be just as powerful as reality, because shipping companies, insurers and governments all make decisions based on what they believe might happen next, not just what has already happened, and that is where the impact begins to spread beyond the immediate incident. Insurance premiums rise, routes are reconsidered, schedules are adjusted, and suddenly the flow of goods begins to slow, not because the strait is physically blocked, but because the conditions around it have become too uncertain to ignore. And then there are the moments when the threat extends beyond the ships themselves, reaching into the infrastructure that supports the entire system, like the attacks on Saudi oil facilities in 2019, which temporarily removed a significant portion of global oil production from the market. And even though those facilities were not located within the strait, they were part of the same network, the same chain that connects production to transportation to consumption. And what that incident demonstrated was that the vulnerability of the system is not limited to a single location. It is spread across multiple points, each one capable of producing effects that ripple outward. And this adds another layer of complexity, because it means that maintaining stability is not just about securing the waterway itself, but about protecting an entire network of interconnected assets. And what becomes clear when you look at all of these events together is that they share a common characteristic. They all came close to something larger. They all approached a boundary that, if crossed, could have triggered a much wider crisis. And yet each time, for different reasons, that boundary held, whether due to restraint, calculation, or simple chance. And this idea of almost becomes central to understanding the strait, because it suggests that the current stability is not the result of an absence of threats, but the result of those threats being managed, contained, or limited just enough to prevent escalation. And that is a very different kind of stability, one that depends on continuous balance rather than fixed security, and that balance can be influenced by many factors: political decisions, changes in leadership, shifts in regional dynamics, or even miscommunication in moments where clarity is most needed. Because in such a crowded and strategically sensitive environment, small misunderstandings can carry significant consequences. Naval vessels operating in close proximity, monitoring each other's movements, interpreting signals, responding to perceived intent. And in those situations, the difference between routine interaction and serious incident can be measured in seconds, in how a maneuver is interpreted, in whether a warning is understood as a precaution or a threat. And this is what makes the Strait such a unique and precarious place. It is not just a physical choke point, it is a place where multiple layers of tension converge: economic, political, and military, all operating at the same time, all influencing how events unfold. And when those layers align in a certain way, the potential for disruption increases, not necessarily through a single dramatic action, but through a chain of smaller events that build on each other, each one adding pressure, each one narrowing the margin for error, until the system is operating much closer to its limits than it appears from the outside. And this is why these incidents matter, not just as isolated stories, but as indicators of how the system behaves under stress, how it responds, how it adapts, and how close it comes to breaking. Because every near miss reveals something about where those limits are, and how easily they could be exceeded, And when you place that understanding alongside everything that has already been established, the lack of true alternatives, the dependence of global systems on this narrow passage, the speed at which disruptions can spread, the picture becomes clearer and more unsettling, because it shows that the question is not whether the strait can be disrupted, that has already been demonstrated in smaller ways, but how far that disruption could go if the conditions were just slightly different, if one incident did not stop where the others did. And in that sense, the history of these events is not just a record of what has happened, it is a preview of what could happen, a series of glimpses into a scenario that the world has come close to experiencing but has not yet fully faced, and that makes every new incident feel less like an isolated event and more like part of an ongoing story, one that is still unfolding, one that continues to test the boundaries of a system that the world depends on far more than most people realize. And when that gradual shift finally crosses the invisible threshold into something unmistakable, it does not arrive with a single dramatic announcement or a clearly defined moment that everyone recognizes at once. It unfolds in fragments, signals appearing in different places almost simultaneously, and in those first hours it is not yet called a crisis. It is described in careful, almost restrained language. Delays, disruptions, uncertainty in the Strait of Hormuz, reports that ships are slowing, that some have turned back, that others are holding position, waiting for instructions that are still being formed, and in trading rooms across the world, far removed from the water itself, screens begin to flicker with numbers that move faster than usual, subtle at first, then increasingly sharp. Oil prices reacting not to confirmed shortages, but to the expectation of them, because markets do not wait for reality. They anticipate it, they move ahead of it, and within minutes of the first, credible reports, the price of crude begins to climb, not gradually, but in sudden, uneven jumps, each movement reflecting a recalculation of risk, a collective realization spreading through thousands of decisions that a significant portion of global supply may be about to become inaccessible, and as the price rises it begins to feed on itself, algorithms triggering further buying, traders rushing to secure contracts before costs climb even higher, and what begins as a reaction becomes a surge, a rapid repricing of energy that sends shockwaves outward into other markets, stock indices responding almost instantly, especially in sectors that are tightly connected to energy costs, airlines, logistics companies, manufacturers, all adjusting in real time to a future that suddenly looks more expensive, more uncertain, more constrained, and at the same time, in offices far from the noise of the markets, decisions are being made that will shape the physical movement of goods, shipping, companies monitoring fragmented information, trying to piece together a situation that is still evolving, and in those early hours the details are incomplete, sometimes contradictory, but the pattern is clear enough to trigger caution. Routes are paused, departures delayed, vessels already en route are instructed to slow down, to wait, or to divert entirely, not because the strait is physically impassable, but because the level of uncertainty has crossed a line that makes continuing forward difficult to justify. And this is where the psychological dimension becomes visible, because the flow of traffic begins to slow not through force, but through decision, a series of individual choices made by companies, captains and insurers that collectively produce the same effect as a blockade. And as ships hesitate, the backlog begins to form, vessels accumulating on either side of the strait, anchored or drifting, waiting for clarity that does not come quickly, and with each passing hour the situation becomes more visible, more defined. Media outlets pick up the story, headlines shift from cautious observations to urgent updates, and the narrative begins to change, moving from possibility to unfolding reality. And alongside this growing visibility, another layer of the system reacts: the insurance market, recalculating risk in real time. Because in high-risk zones, insurance is not optional, it is essential. And as risk levels increase, premiums rise sharply, sometimes within hours, reflecting the heightened chance of damage or loss. And for shipping companies, this creates an additional barrier, because even if they are willing to accept the operational risk, the financial cost of ensuring that risk may suddenly become too high, effectively grounding vessels not through physical obstruction, but through economic pressure. And this interaction between perception, cost, and decision-making accelerates the disruption, because it compounds hesitation with structural limits, making it increasingly difficult for normal operations to resume. And as the first day continues to unfold, governments begin to respond more visibly, issuing statements, calling emergency meetings, activating contingency plans that have existed for years but are rarely used in practice. Strategic reserves are discussed, diplomatic channels open, military forces may be repositioned, not necessarily to engage immediately, but to signal readiness, to reassure allies, to discourage further escalation. And these actions, while intended to stabilize the situation, also reinforce the seriousness of what is happening, confirming to markets, companies, and the public that this is no longer a minor disruption, but something with wider implications, and that confirmation feeds back into the system, influencing behavior at every level, creating a feedback loop where each response amplifies the next. And beyond the immediate financial and logistical reactions, there is a quieter shift that begins to take hold, one that moves through expectations, as businesses start to anticipate higher costs. Airlines begin calculating fuel surcharges, manufacturers reassess supply chains, and even in places far removed from the Strait, the awareness that a critical point in the global system has been disrupted starts to influence decisions, not through panic, but through adjustment. Small changes that collectively begin to reshape demand, pricing, and planning, and all of this unfolds within the span of hours, not days, because the systems involved are built for speed, designed to react quickly to new information. And when that speed is directed toward disruption, the effects can spread with remarkable intensity, turning what might seem like a localized issue into a global event almost instantly. And as the first 24 hours come to a close, the initial uncertainty gives way to a clearer, though still incomplete picture. The flow through the strait has slowed to a fraction of its normal pace. Prices have surged and remain volatile. Markets have absorbed the shock but have not stabilized, and the realization begins to settle in, not as a single moment, but as a growing understanding that the system, which once appeared seamless and constant, is now operating under conditions that are fundamentally different, and that the consequences of this shift will not be limited to a single day, but will continue to unfold, shaped by the decisions made in these first critical hours and by the underlying vulnerabilities that have been building beneath the surface all along. And as the first wave of reaction settles into something more sustained, the disruption begins to move beyond the places where it is immediately visible, beyond trading screens and shipping routes, into the deeper layers of the system that most people never see, but depend on every single day. Because oil is not just a commodity that fuels cars or powers planes, it is woven into the structure of modern life in ways that remain almost invisible until the flow that sustains it begins to weaken. And one of the first places this becomes clear is in the global supply chains that stretch across continents. vast networks designed for precision, where materials and products move with timing so exact that delays are measured in hours, not days. And these systems depend on stability, on the assumption that energy will remain available, that transportation costs will stay within expected limits, that shipments will arrive when they're supposed to, and when the price of oil surges and the movement through the Strait of Hormuz slows, that stability begins to slip not suddenly, but in ways that are easy to miss at first. Freight costs begin to rise, forcing companies to recalculate their routes and schedules. Some shipments become too expensive to justify at previous volumes, leading to delays, reductions, or cancellations, and these decisions ripple outward, affecting not just the movement of raw materials, but the delivery of finished goods, and in warehouses and distribution centers, inventory levels that were carefully optimized for efficiency begin to show signs of strain. Because the just-in-time model leaves almost no room for disruption, it is designed for speed, not for resilience. And as shipments arrive later than expected, gaps begin to appear. Small at first, a missing component here, a delayed delivery there. But as those gaps multiply, they begin to affect production itself. Assembly lines that depend on a steady and predictable flow of parts slow down, pause or stop entirely, not because demand has disappeared, but because one essential piece in a long chain has failed to arrive on time. And this is where the interconnected nature of the system becomes impossible to ignore, because disruption in one place does not stay contained, it spreads, creating a chain reaction that reaches far beyond the original point of impact. And alongside these logistical pressures, the availability of fuel itself begins to tighten, not necessarily in the form of immediate widespread shortages, but through uneven strain that appears in specific regions first, depending on how reliant they are on energy supplies that pass through the strait. And in those places, fuel prices begin to climb more sharply, sometimes noticeably within days, and with rising prices comes a shift in behaviour. People fill their tanks more often, businesses increase their reserves, not because supply has disappeared, but because the fear of scarcity changes how people act, and that behaviour adds further pressure to an already strained system, increasing demand at the very moment supply is becoming more uncertain. And beyond transportation, the impact extends into sectors that are less obviously connected to oil, such as agriculture, where energy plays a central role not only in powering machinery, but in producing fertilizers, many of which are derived from natural gas, a resource that is also heavily tied to the same region. And when the flow of gas is disrupted or its price increases, the cost of producing fertilizers rises, and this effect moves quickly down the chain. Farmers face higher input costs, forcing difficult decisions about how much to plant, how much fertilizer to use, and over time these decisions can influence crop yields, which then affects food supply and pricing. And this connection between energy and food is something most people rarely think about. Yet it becomes very real when disruptions occur because it reveals how deeply connected these systems are, and in manufacturing the effects unfold in a similar way. Factories that rely on energy-intensive processes face rising costs, forcing them to reduce output, adjust schedules, or pass those costs on through higher prices, and these changes begin to feed into the broader economy, influencing everything from the cost of everyday goods to employment levels in industries that depend on steady production. And what makes this phase of disruption particularly challenging is that it does not arrive with a clear beginning or a single defining moment. It builds gradually through a series of adjustments, each one a response to changing conditions, and while each individual adjustment may seem manageable on its own, together they create a cumulative effect that is far more significant, because they interact, reinforce each other, and amplify the overall impact. And this is where the idea of ripple effects becomes something more concrete, not just a metaphor but a real process through which disruption spreads across a system that is both complex and tightly connected. And as these ripples expand, they begin to reshape expectations. Businesses revise forecasts, governments reassess strategies, and individuals adjust their daily behavior, all responding to a situation that continues to evolve in real time. And in this context, the original disruption, the slowing or partial stopping of movement through the Strait of Hormuz, becomes less of a single event and more of a turning point, a moment that reveals the underlying dependencies of the modern world, showing how energy, transportation, food production, and industry are all linked in ways that are easy to overlook when everything is functioning normally. And as the system adjusts to this new reality, the effects begin to appear in everyday life, not always in dramatic or immediately visible ways, but in the accumulation of small changes, higher costs, delayed deliveries, subtle shortages, and shifting expectations, all of which signal that something fundamental has changed, that the system is no longer operating under the conditions it once relied on, and that this change, once it takes hold, does not simply disappear. It continues to unfold, shaping the way the world functions for as long as the disruption remains in place. And as those subtle shifts begin to accumulate across supply chains and industries, they start to converge into something far more visible, a broader transformation that reaches deep into the economic fabric of entire countries. Because when energy becomes more expensive, it does not remain contained within the sectors that consume it most directly. It spreads outward, embedding itself into the cost of nearly everything. And this is where inflation begins to take hold, not as a sudden spike in one category, but as a steady and widespread increase that touches food, transportation, manufacturing, housing, and services, each one carrying a portion of the rising energy cost. And at first these changes may seem small, almost manageable. A slight increase in fuel prices, a gradual rise in shipping costs. But as the disruption in the Strait of Hormuz continues, these increases begin to layer on top of each other, compounding over time, and what once felt temporary starts to feel persistent, harder to absorb, harder to ignore, especially in economies that are already operating close to their limits. And this is where the difference between countries becomes more pronounced, because not all nations experience this pressure in the same way. Some have more tools at their disposal, more flexibility, more buffers built into their systems, and in developed economies, governments may attempt to soften the impact through strategic reserves, subsidies, or adjustments in monetary policy, trying to stabilize prices and maintain confidence, at least in the short term. But even in these cases, the cost does not disappear. It is simply shifted, often into public spending, increased borrowing, or long-term economic trade-offs that may not be immediately visible but become significant over time, influencing debt levels, currency stability, and future growth. While in developing countries, the effects tend to appear more quickly and more intensely, because energy imports often represent a larger share of their overall expenses, and when prices rise sharply, the impact is felt directly by both governments and individuals, as the cost of essential goods increases, and for many households, where a large portion of income is already spent on basic needs like food and transportation, even a relatively small increase can have a significant effect, forcing difficult decisions, reducing consumption, and in some cases pushing families into deeper financial strain. And this is where the economic pressure begins to intersect with the social reality, because prolonged increases in the cost of living do not remain purely economic. They begin to shape behavior, expectations, and stability. And in some regions, this may lead to public frustration, to protests, to visible expressions of dissatisfaction as people react to rising prices and shrinking purchasing power, while in others it may create quieter forms of pressure, building over time as governments face growing demands to intervene, to provide relief, to restore stability, and those responses can take many forms, some immediate, some reactive, such as price controls, subsidies, or restrictions on exports, measures designed to ease short-term pressure, but which can also introduce new complications, distorting markets, reducing supply, or shifting imbalances elsewhere in the system. And as these decisions unfold across different countries, the global landscape begins to change, becoming less coordinated, more fragmented, because each nation is responding to its own challenges, its own priorities, and this fragmentation adds another layer to the disruption, making the flow of goods and resources less predictable, less efficient, and more vulnerable to further shocks, and at the same time financial markets continue to adjust, not only reacting to current conditions, but constantly anticipating what might come next. Currencies fluctuate as investors reassess risk. Capital moves between regions in search of stability, and these shifts have tangible effects, influencing borrowing costs, investment decisions, and the overall resilience of economies under pressure. And what begins to emerge from all of this is a kind of domino effect, not a simple chain where one event follows another in a straight line, but a complex network of interactions where each consequence reinforces the next, amplifying the overall impact. And this is what makes the situation so difficult to contain once it reaches this stage, because there is no single solution, no single action that can reverse everything at once. Instead, it requires coordinated responses across multiple areas: energy policy, economic management, international cooperation, all of which take time, resources, and alignment that may be difficult to achieve in the midst of a rapidly evolving situation. And even with those efforts, the outcome remains uncertain, because the underlying disruption that triggered these changes may still be unresolved. And as this process continues, the original event, the slowdown or partial blockage of movement through the Strait of Hormuz, becomes part of a much larger story, one that extends far beyond shipping lanes and oil markets, encompassing the stability of economies, the daily realities of millions of people, and the ability of global systems to adapt under sustained pressure. And in that broader context, the urgency of the first hours gives way to something more enduring, a recognition that the effects of such a disruption are not limited to a single moment in time, but can persist, shaping conditions over weeks, months, or even longer, depending on how the situation evolves and how effectively it is managed. And it is here that the full weight of the scenario becomes clear, not as a single dramatic crisis, but as an unfolding series of consequences, each one connected to the next, all tracing back to a narrow stretch of water where the flow of energy, and with it the rhythm of modern life, has been interrupted, setting in motion a chain of events that becomes increasingly difficult to stop once it has begun. Out at sea, far beyond the reach of headlines and financial screens, the disruption does not feel like a global crisis at first. It feels like something quieter, slower, almost unreal. A tanker that should be moving instead, holding position in open water, engines humming at low power, a crew that expected motion now suspended in uncertainty. And on the bridge, the routine begins to stretch into something unfamiliar. Navigation systems still active, radar still sweeping, but the destination suddenly uncertain, instructions delayed, decisions postponed, and for the people on board, this is not about markets or geopolitics. It is about time. about contracts that quietly extend, about families waiting on the other side of the world, about the strange tension of being ready to move but unable to do so. And as the hours pass, that tension settles into a kind of controlled unease, because nothing is visibly wrong. The sea is calm, the ship is intact. Yet something invisible has interrupted the purpose of the journey, and that feeling spreads across the water. Dozens, then hundreds of vessels in similar positions, each one part of a network that has slowed without fully stopping. Each crew experiencing the same uncertainty and isolation, connected only by radio updates and fragmented reports that offer no clear timeline, and closer to land the change becomes easier to see. In ports that are usually defined by constant motion, by cranes lifting containers in a steady rhythm, by trucks lining up with predictable precision, that rhythm begins to break, not all at once but unevenly. Fewer arrivals, longer gaps, schedules that no longer match expectations, and for the workers who depend on that rhythm, the shift is immediate. Hours become uncertain, shifts are reduced or rescheduled. The flow that once felt automatic now feels fragile. Because ports are not just places where goods arrive, they are points in a chain that depends on continuous movement, and when that movement slows upstream, everything downstream begins to adjust, sometimes subtly, sometimes abruptly, and beyond the ports the disruption moves inland, carried along highways and rail lines that connect supply to demand. Truck drivers waiting for loads that do not arrive on time, routes that no longer make sense as fuel costs rise and deliveries become unpredictable. And for many of these drivers, the margin between profit and loss is already narrow, so even a small disruption can ripple into real consequences. Fewer trips, longer waiting times, income that becomes harder to rely on, and in the air the pattern repeats in a different form. Airlines watching fuel prices climb, adjusting schedules, calculating costs in real time, introducing changes that filter down to pilots, crew members, ground staff, each one adapting to a system that is becoming more expensive and less predictable. And while these adjustments may appear as numbers in reports, they are experienced as changes in daily life, altered schedules, increased pressure, a sense that stability is slipping just enough to be noticed. And then there are the people who are not directly connected to shipping or logistics, who do not see the ships waiting or the ports slowing, but who begin to feel the impact in quieter ways, at the fuel station where prices have risen within days, at the supermarket where certain products become more expensive or slightly harder to find, in monthly expenses that no longer match expectations. And for many, the connection between these changes and a narrow waterway thousands of kilometers away is not immediately obvious, yet the link is there, woven through the system in ways that are usually invisible. And this is where the disruption becomes most real, not in a single dramatic moment, but in the accumulation of small changes that begin to reshape everyday life. And as people adjust, filling their tanks more often, reconsidering travel, cutting back in other areas to balance rising costs, the behavior of the system shifts again. Demand patterns change, pressures increase, and what started as a disruption in movement becomes a change in how people live and decide. And this human layer is what gives the situation its full weight, because the system is not just infrastructure or trade routes, it is made up of individuals, each one responding to signals that are often indirect but deeply felt, and the longer the disruption continues, the more these responses compound, creating a feedback loop where uncertainty leads to caution, caution leads to reduced activity, and reduced activity reinforces the sense that something is wrong. And across different regions the experience varies. Some absorb the impact more easily, others feel it immediately. but everywhere the pattern is the same. A gradual shift away from normal, a growing awareness that the systems people rely on are not as stable as they once seemed. And in that awareness there is a quiet realization, not always spoken but widely felt, that the flow which connects these lives, this constant movement of energy and goods, is more fragile than it appears, and that when it slows, even slightly, the effects are not distant or abstract. They are personal, unfolding in the routines, decisions, and uncertainties of everyday life. And while the disruption continues to ripple through everyday lives, far from the ships and ports and rising prices, another layer of the story is already unfolding, one that rarely appears fully in public view, but quietly defines what is possible and what is not. Because behind every slowdown in the Strait of Hormuz there is a constant military presence, a balance of power that has been carefully maintained for decades, and in that narrow stretch of water this presence is not symbolic. It is active, calculated, and always watching, with naval forces positioned not just to respond to crises, but to prevent them from spiraling out of control. And among those forces, the United States Navy plays a central role, maintaining a continuous presence in the region through its Fifth Fleet, operating from bases that allow rapid deployment into the Gulf, with aircraft carriers, destroyers, surveillance aircraft, and patrol vessels, forming a layered system designed to monitor threats, protect shipping lanes, and respond quickly when something goes wrong. And on paper, this represents one of the most powerful maritime forces ever assembled, equipped with advanced radar, missile defense systems, and real-time intelligence capabilities that can track movements across vast distances. And yet the reality of operating in the Strait of Hormuz is far more complicated than raw strength alone, because the geography itself limits how that strength can be used. The waterway is narrow, traffic is dense, coastlines are close, and every movement takes place within a confined space where reaction time is reduced, and mistakes carry greater consequences. And in that environment, even the most advanced navy cannot operate with complete freedom. It must move carefully, deliberately, constantly aware that the smallest miscalculation could escalate into something larger. And this is where the strategy on the other side becomes critical, because Iran's approach to the strait has never been about matching military power ship for ship. It has been about reshaping the environment in ways that reduce the advantage of that power, relying on tactics that are designed to disrupt rather than defeat, to create pressure without triggering a full-scale response. And among the most effective of these tactics are naval mines, simple devices that can be deployed quickly and quietly, often without immediate detection. And once there is even a suspicion that mines are present, the entire dynamic of the strait changes, because ships cannot simply continue as normal. They must slow down, reroute, or stop altogether. And clearing those mines is not a fast process. It requires specialized vessels moving methodically through the water, scanning for threats, identifying them one by one, often under conditions where the possibility of additional attack still exists. And this creates a situation where a relatively small action can lead to a prolonged disruption, not because the waterway is physically blocked, but because it is no longer considered safe. And beyond mines, there are other elements that reinforce this strategy. Coastal missile systems that can be hidden along the shoreline and moved as needed, capable of targeting ships passing through the narrow corridor. Fast attack boats that can operate in groups, moving quickly and unpredictably through the water, forcing larger vessels to react defensively. And all of these factors combine to create an environment where control is never absolute, where even a dominant naval presence must constantly adapt to a shifting set of risks. And this is what makes the situation so difficult to resolve quickly, because restoring normal flow is not just about removing a single obstacle. It is about managing a range of potential threats that can reappear in different forms, and at the same time every action taken to secure the strait carries its own risk, because increasing military presence, conducting operations or responding to incidents can be interpreted in different ways, and in such a tightly contested space, interpretation matters because it shapes how the other side responds. And this is where the danger of escalation becomes most real, not as a sudden decision, but as a chain of reactions where one move leads to another, where defensive actions can be seen as offensive, and where the line between maintaining security and triggering conflict becomes increasingly thin. And for global powers involved in the region, this creates a constant balancing act. The need to keep the strait open, to reassure markets and allies, while also avoiding steps that could push the situation beyond control. And this balance is not fixed. It shifts with every incident, every signal, every change in conditions. And as the disruption continues and pressure builds across economic systems and human lives, this underlying military reality remains in place, shaping what responses are possible, how quickly stability can return, and how close the world might come to a scenario where keeping the strait open is no longer just a matter of security, but part of a much larger and more dangerous confrontation that no one truly wants, but becomes harder to avoid the longer the tension continues. And as the days stretch into weeks, the urgency that defined the first hours begins to transform into something heavier, less visible but far more consequential. Because the system is no longer reacting to a sudden shock, it is adapting to a new reality, one where disruption is no longer temporary but sustained. And this is where the deeper changes begin to take hold, not in dramatic headlines, but in decisions that reshape how countries manage energy, how economies adjust, and how relationships between nations begin to shift under pressure. And one of the first visible signs of this transition appears in the use of strategic reserves, stockpiles of oil that have been built over years, specifically for moments like this, held back as a safeguard against supply disruptions. And now, slowly, those reserves begin to be released, governments announcing measured drawdowns, calculated not to solve the problem entirely, but to stabilize it, to buy time, to prevent prices from spiraling even further out of control. And for a brief moment, this creates a sense of relief. Markets respond, prices soften slightly, the immediate pressure eases, but beneath that surface the reality remains unchanged, because reserves are finite. They are not a replacement for continuous flow. They are a bridge. And as that bridge is used, the question becomes not just how long it can hold, but what lies on the other side if the disruption continues, and at the same time the broader economy begins to adjust in ways that are slower but more enduring. Growth projections are revised downward. Industries that rely heavily on energy scale back operations. Investments are delayed or cancelled, and what started as a disruption in one narrow waterway begins to translate into a wider economic slowdown. Not necessarily a sudden collapse, but a gradual loss of momentum, where businesses become more cautious, spending decreases, and uncertainty becomes a constant factor in decision-making. And this slowdown does not affect all regions equally. Some economies absorb it more effectively, drawing on reserves, diversifying supply, managing the impact through policy, while others feel it more sharply, particularly those that depend heavily on imported energy or lack the financial flexibility to cushion the shock. And in those regions, the effects can become more visible. Reduced industrial output, rising costs, pressure on currencies, all contributing to a sense that the disruption is not just external, but deeply internal, affecting the stability of the economy itself. And alongside these economic adjustments, another shift begins to emerge, one that is less immediate but potentially more lasting. the reconfiguration of alliances and relationships between countries, because energy is not just a resource, it is a foundation of geopolitical influence, and when its flow is disrupted, the balance of that influence begins to change. Countries that can supply energy gain leverage, those that depend on it seek alternatives. New agreements are negotiated, old partnerships are reconsidered, and in some cases entirely new connections begin to form, linking producers and consumers in ways that did not exist before. And this process is not instantaneous. It unfolds over time, shaped by necessity, by opportunity, and by the recognition that reliance on a single route or region carries risks that can no longer be ignored. And this recognition drives investment into alternative pathways, pipelines that bypass vulnerable areas, shipping routes that, while longer, offer greater security, and even shifts toward different energy sources, not as a sudden transformation, but as a gradual rebalancing of priorities. And within this shifting landscape, the strategic importance of the Strait of Hormuz does not disappear, but it is recontextualized, seen not just as a critical artery, but as a point of vulnerability that has revealed the fragility of the system built around it. And as governments and industries respond to that realization, the geopolitical map begins to adjust. Alliances deepen in some areas, strain in others, cooperation increases where interests align, and tension rises where they do not. And all of these changes are happening against the backdrop of a disruption that continues to influence every decision, every calculation, because the longer the situation persists, the more it shapes expectations about the future. And this is where the psychological dimension returns, not in the immediate panic of the first day, but in a more sustained form, a shift in how risk is perceived, how stability is defined, and how resilience is measured. And for the global system, this represents a turning point, not necessarily a permanent break, but a moment where assumptions are challenged, where the idea of uninterrupted flow is replaced by a more cautious understanding of how easily that flow can be disrupted. And as weeks pass and the world continues to operate under these altered conditions, the effects become part of a new baseline, something that is no longer surprising but expected, integrated into planning, into pricing, into policy. And in that sense, the disruption of the Strait of Hormuz extends far beyond its physical boundaries, reshaping not just the movement of oil, but the structure of the systems that depend on it, creating a world that looks familiar on the surface, but operates under a different set of assumptions beneath, where the memory of interruption continues to influence decisions long after the initial shock has passed. And yet, despite everything that has been revealed, the vulnerability, the tension, the repeated near misses, and the very real possibility of disruption, the Strait of Hormuz continues to function. Ships continue to pass through it, oil continues to flow, and this is not because the risks are small or because the situation is stable, but because there is a deeper force holding everything in place, something less visible than fleets or markets, but just as powerful, a shared understanding that shutting down this narrow passage would not create a limited crisis. It would trigger consequences that spread far beyond any single country or region, and that understanding quietly shapes behavior, often without being openly acknowledged, because every actor involved is tied into the same system of dependence. Oil-producing nations rely on the strait to export their resources and sustain their economies, while consuming nations depend on that same flow to power transportation, industry, and everyday life. And this mutual dependence creates a situation where disruption does not create winners. It creates shared losses, and that is what makes the idea of a full closure so complicated, because even those who might gain short-term leverage through higher prices would still be exposed to the broader fallout, reduced demand, economic instability, and the risk of escalation that could damage critical infrastructure and disrupt other forms of trade. And this shared exposure acts as a powerful form of deterrence, not imposed by a single authority, but emerging naturally from the structure of the system itself. And layered on top of that is the presence of global powers whose interests, despite competition in other areas, align when it comes to keeping this passage open. Because a disruption here would not stay contained, it would ripple through financial markets, supply chains, and political stability worldwide. And this creates a kind of indirect coordination where decisions are shaped not only by immediate goals but by an awareness of how those decisions will be interpreted by others. And in this environment, signals matter. Movements at sea, public statements, even moments of restraint all carry meaning, influencing expectations and helping to keep the situation below the threshold of open conflict. And that threshold itself is not fixed. It shifts depending on political conditions, leadership decisions, and external pressures. But it remains a line that all sides are aware of, even if they approach it from different angles. And what prevents that line from being crossed is not certainty, but calculation, a constant weighing of consequences, a recognition that escalation would not remain limited, that it would spread beyond the strait into wider regions, affecting trade routes, financial systems, and drawing in additional actors whose involvement would make the situation far more difficult to control. And this is where the balance becomes most fragile, because it depends not only on strategy but on perception, on each side correctly interpreting the intentions and limits of the other. And in a space where communication is often indirect and actions can be ambiguous, that understanding is never perfect, yet it holds together just enough to prevent the worst outcomes. And over time, this has created a pattern, a series of incidents that push the boundaries without fully breaking them, each one reinforcing the idea that while disruption is always possible, complete closure carries consequences that are too large to accept. And this pattern is what gives the Strait its unique character, a place that is both highly exposed and unexpectedly resilient, where the same factors that make it vulnerable also contribute to its continued operation, because the cost of failure is so high that it influences decisions before that failure can happen. And as the world continues to depend on the steady flow of energy through this narrow passage, that balance remains in place, not as something stable or guaranteed, but as something constantly adjusted, constantly tested, and always under pressure. And it is within this fragile balance that the Strait continues to function, not because it is protected from disruption, but because the consequences of stopping it are so significant that they shape behavior in advance, creating a situation where the flow continues not by accident, but by a shared understanding, however uneasy, that once it stops, the outcome is no longer easy for anyone to control. And as that uneasy balance continues to hold, what becomes harder to ignore is not just how close the system comes to disruption, but how it was built in the first place, because the vulnerability exposed in the Strait of Hormuz is not an accident. It is the result of decades of decisions that prioritize speed, scale, and efficiency above all else, creating a global network that functions with remarkable precision but leaves very little room for error. And in many ways, this system is a success story. A structure that has allowed goods, energy, and resources to move across continents faster and more reliably than at any other point in history, enabling economies to grow, industries to expand, and everyday life to operate with the level of convenience that often goes unnoticed. Because when everything works, it feels natural, almost invisible, as if it could not function any other way. And yet that sense of stability is built on a set of trade-offs that are rarely considered until something disrupts the flow, because in order to achieve maximum efficiency, the system has been designed to minimize redundancy, to reduce surpass capacity, to eliminate anything that appears unnecessary in the short term. And this means that there are fewer buffers, fewer alternative routes, fewer Zappos supplies waiting in reserve, and as long as the flow remains uninterrupted, this approach works exceptionally well. Costs stay low, delivery times stay short, and the entire system operates at a pace that reinforces its own design. But the moment a disruption occurs, the weaknesses become visible, not as a single point of failure, but as a chain of dependencies that amplify the impact. And this is what makes the Strait of Hormuz such a powerful example. Because it is not just a narrow passage, it is a reflection of how the entire system has been structured, concentrated, optimized, and dependent on continuous movement. And when that movement slows even slightly, the effects spread quickly, revealing how tightly everything is connected. And this tight connection is what allows for efficiency, but it is also what reduces flexibility. Because when each part depends on the precise timing and function of the others, there is less ability to absorb delays, less capacity to adjust without consequences. And this is where the idea of resilience comes into focus, not as the opposite of efficiency, but as something that must be balanced with it. The ability to continue functioning even when conditions are not ideal, to adapt when disruptions occur, and to recover without triggering wider instability. And in the current system, resilience often takes a secondary role, not because it is unimportant, but because it comes at a cost. Maintaining Zappos capacity, diversifying supply routes, holding larger inventories. All of these measures reduce efficiency in the short term, making operations more expensive. And in a competitive global environment where cost matters, those trade-offs are often minimized. And over time, this leads to a system that is highly optimized but also finely balanced, where even small disruptions can create disproportionate effects. And the Strait of Hormuz highlights this balance in a way that is difficult to ignore, because it concentrates a significant portion of global energy flow into a single, narrow corridor. Efficient because it is the shortest and most direct route, but fragile because there are limited alternatives that can handle the same volume, and this concentration is not unique. It exists in different forms across the global system, in supply chains that rely on specific regions for key components, in trade routes that depend on critical choke points, in industries that operate with minimal Zappos inventory, all of which contribute to a network that is fast and efficient but also exposed. And when a disruption occurs, it does not just affect one area. It reveals the structure of the entire system, showing how decisions made over years, sometimes decades, have shaped the way resources move and how risks are distributed. And this realization is not immediate. It emerges gradually as the effects of disruption unfold and as governments, industries, and organizations begin to reassess their assumptions, to question whether the balance between efficiency and resilience has been pushed too far in one direction. And in some cases, this leads to change, investments in alternative routes, diversification of suppliers, the creation of strategic Zappos that can be used in times of disruption. But these changes are not simple or quick. They require time, coordination, and a willingness to accept higher costs in exchange for greater stability. And even then, the system does not become immune to disruption. It becomes more adaptable, more capable of absorbing shocks, but still dependent on the same underlying principles that define global trade. And this is what gives the situation its broader, significance, because it is not just about one strait or one moment of crisis. It is about the way the modern world has been built, the priorities that have shaped it, and the ongoing challenge of balancing efficiency with resilience in a system that connects billions of people and countless processes into a single continuous flow. And as that flow is tested, even briefly, it forces a deeper understanding of how it works, what it depends on, and how it might evolve in response to the pressures that reveal both its strengths and its vulnerabilities. And in the end, after all the tension, the calculations, the near misses, and the cascading consequences, everything returns to the same narrow stretch of water, a place that, on most days, does not feel like the center of anything at all, where the horizon looks calm, where the movement of ships appears routine, almost slow, as if nothing about it carries the weight it truly holds. And yet that quiet surface conceals one of the most important functions in the modern world. Because whether the crisis fades or continues, whether ships begin moving freely again or remain held back by uncertainty, the Strait of Hormuz does not change in appearance. It remains the same thin passage between land and sea, unchanged in size, unchanged in geography, and that contrast is what makes it so difficult to fully grasp, because something so small, so visually unremarkable, can carry such enormous significance. And as traffic gradually resumes, if it does not happen all at once. It begins with hesitation, a few vessels testing the route, moving cautiously, guided by updated information, by reassurances that conditions are stabilizing, and behind those decisions are layers of analysis, risk assessments recalculated, insurance premiums adjusted, naval patrols repositioned, all of it working quietly to restore a sense of normality that, only days or weeks earlier, had been broken, and from a distance it may look like a simple return to routine, ships passing through a channel as they always have. But beneath that routine is a deeper awareness, one that lingers even after the immediate disruption has passed, because once a system has revealed its vulnerability, it cannot be unseen, and the memory of how quickly things shifted, how rapidly the flow slowed, how deeply the effects reached into economies and daily life, remains present, shaping decisions in ways that are subtle but lasting. And for those directly involved, the crews who waited at sea, the operators who paused, shipments, the analyst who watched markets react in real time, the experience leaves a mark, a recognition that what once felt stable is in fact contingent, dependent on conditions that can change, and this awareness extends outward, beyond the immediate participants, into the broader understanding of how the world functions, because the Strait of Hormuz is not unique in its role as a critical point. It is one example among many, but it is perhaps the clearest illustration of how much of modern life depends on places that are rarely considered, routes that remain out of sight, systems that operate continuously without drawing attention to themselves, and when those systems work, they fade into the background, becoming part of an assumed reality. But when they are disrupted, even briefly, they reveal the structure that supports everything else. And this is where the final realization begins to take shape, not as a dramatic conclusion, but as a quiet understanding that the stability of the world is not defined by what is visible, but by what continues to function without interruption, and that stability is maintained not just by technology or infrastructure, but by a complex balance of decisions, incentives, and shared dependencies that keep the system moving. And in that sense, the Strait of Hormuz becomes more than a location. It becomes a symbol of that balance, a place where geography, economics, and human decision-making intersect in a way that sustains a flow that reaches far beyond its own boundaries. And as ships continue to pass through it, or hesitate at its edges, The movement itself carries meaning. Each vessel a reminder of the connection between distant places, between production and consumption, between cause and effect, and even when everything appears calm again, that meaning does not disappear. It remains embedded in the awareness that what seems permanent is often the result of conditions that must be continuously maintained, and that the line between normal operation and disruption is thinner than it appears. And perhaps that is what lingers most, not the image of crisis, but the recognition of dependence, the understanding that so much of what defines modern life relies on systems that are both powerful and delicate, capable of extraordinary efficiency, but also subject to forces that can alter their course. And as long as that balance holds, the world continues to move, ships cross the strait, energy flows, industries operate, and life goes on in a way that feels steady, predictable, almost inevitable. But beneath that sense of inevitability is the quiet presence of places like this, narrow, often overlooked, yet essential, holding together the rhythms of a world that rarely pauses to notice them until it has to.